Hi, everyone. Well, when we first heard back in 2019 that Singapore was about to put a moratorium on all new data center development, I think that probably came as quite a shock to all of us. Even more surprising was when Amsterdam followed suit the same year. And as we all know, that the trend in market disruptions didn't stop there. It actually has been spreading over the last couple of years to multiple major interconnection markets. In addition to this increasing number of markets wrestling with data center energy usage, we now have another short-term problem that's very acute, and that's namely Russia's war against Ukraine and the fallout due to energy price increases. So this is what I really want to unpack in the next few minutes, is this confluence of both this long-term issue about sustainability in the data center sector and short-term issues with price volatility due to the energy crisis. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. So let's talk first about what's going on with this sustainability issue. So of course, this centers to a large degree on how much power do data centers really use. So just a quick snapshot view of that. According to the International Energy Agency, data centers account for about 1% of all power usage globally, not an insignificant amount for a relatively small industry. When we get down to the more localized level in some of the biggest interconnection markets, that percentage gets a lot higher, up to 2.5% for the EU as a whole. More like 7% of all energy used in Singapore is used for data centers. And then just a depiction from some of our research here, just looking at some of the biggest interconnection markets. By our estimates, 4.3 terawatts of power is used for the retail colocation sector alone in these markets. So that doesn't even account for hyperscale, wholesale, enterprise, Bitcoin, and all of that other stuff. So these are the markets that we're going to focus on over the next few minutes. So Frankfurt and Singapore kind of got the ball rolling a couple of years ago with this kind of examination of and soul searching of what we do about the sustainability of the data center sector going forward. Amsterdam then followed suit, and then we had this incredible surprise that just several months ago when Dominion Energy declared that they wouldn't be able to provision power for new data centers for at least several years, which came as an absolute shock. And it's not that, and they did clarify that the energy is there, it's been sourced, they just can't get it to you. So, you know, kind of a minor distinction when you're left in the dark anyway. So that's the situation in these markets, some of the very biggest interconnection markets in the world. So let's talk about the current situation in each of these places and how the industry seems to be responding to some degree right now. So what we have happening in Singapore at the moment is that it's back to a crawling start, essentially, with a pilot program being implemented to look at how best to do best practices for data center development going forward. So this is long-term change being implemented right now with a relatively modest 60 megawatt project in total. So limited number of new facilities will be commissioned to be launched in the near future here while this is taking place. From what we can see in our data, there hasn't been a whole lot of activity since this moratorium started in terms of new development. We saw a couple of major data center sites deployed from major local providers there, like Digital Realty and Equinix and STT. But these were projects that were already approved before the moratorium took place. So that's the situation there. In terms of what's going to happen in the pipeline, that remains to be seen. And you know, I'm just going to read this quote because I think it's really poignant, not just for Singapore, but for all the markets that we're looking at. What's clear in the days is that the days of new hyperscale data centers in Singapore are over, and that any players that haven't got projects underway have missed the boat. They're now left with the option of acquiring an existing facility, vying for limited slots with far more stringent rules and modestly sized data centers, or building new data centers elsewhere. That's from Data Center Dynamics earlier last year. So that's the current situation. So how's the industry responding to this situation? From what we can see right now, a lot of the demand that would be expanded in Singapore is spilling over into new markets. And this is just one example that I'm going to highlight here with Malaysia, because as many of you know, a lot of this development is spreading across Southeast Asia. There are a number of very dynamic new markets with a lot of investment pouring in, Indonesia, Thailand, and others as well, Philippines. But what's interesting about the example of Malaysia is it's right across the strait. It's right next door. There are a lot more cables coming into Singapore. There's a lot more network demand, a lot more traffic that has to be delivered in nearby markets. And so that demand has to go somewhere. And without the ability to quickly scale up new data centers in Singapore, some of that demand certainly seems to be spilling over into Malaysia. And indeed, we see a lot of projects happening there in Kuala Lumpur, and even more recently in Johor Bahru, as you see international companies building there with near virtual latency to Singapore from that location. So this is one of a number of places that we think that demand is spilling into for Singapore. Let's look at the situation in the Netherlands. So again, they also initially halted new data center growth in 2019, started it back up again in a controlled phase of examination, and then put a new halt on new hyperscale data center development again just about a year ago. That moratorium was specific to hyperscale data centers. Meta very publicly pulled out of a project in Zeevold, which would have been the largest project in the Netherlands. So how's the market responding there? Well, it's kind of hurry up and wait. There's not a lot of new activity. We've seen a few new sites roll out in the last few years, but a couple of very major projects in Amsterdam have had seemingly significant delays over this period. At the same time, land banks are still being bought up in places like Groningen, which is exempt from these restrictions. So there's certainly the sense that this market is so critical that no matter what happens, you still have to invest in opportunities there. Looking at Frankfurt, the city itself there in 2021 started putting together regulations, policies related to the sustainability of data centers within the city. And in just this past June, they put together a policy pertaining to zoning for data centers and waste heat sharing with other parts of the economy there. There's been some pushback on the policies that have been put in place. The German Data Center Association has basically said, this is unrealistic, we can't do this on the scale and in the timetable that you all want us to do it. But that's the situation there. So what's happening in that market? How's the sector responding? So far, Frankfurt has been moving along at a pretty robust rate despite the disruption, the examination that's happening there. Of the projects that we see developing in the Frankfurt Metro over the past year and looking forward in the pipeline, about 70% of them are actually in the surrounding metro area. So outside the city limits, for the most part, there's still development happening in the city with a couple of the largest interconnection providers, as well as one company that's owned by an energy company and is developing its own plans for waste heat usage there. But for the most part, a lot of the wholesale and hyperscale development taking place is in surrounding suburbs with companies developing out there. So still a lot of activity, but there's also uncertainty as to whether the policies being put in place in Frankfurt are going to expand to the national level, as the national government is now looking at regulations there too. So that's very key. Even though we see ongoing development, this may spread from Frankfurt to the entire nation in short time. Northern Virginia, here's a nice picture of Highway 1 in Big Sur, outside Big Sur from a couple years ago, if you remember. just nowhere to go. And this is, again, such a shocking situation to find that there wouldn't be enough transport capacity for energy with the existing 500 kilovolt transmission lines that they have currently up and running. So Dominion Energy is scrambling to build new transmission routes, won't be ready till at least 2025. Loudoun County, for the first time, is going to no longer fast-track new data center development. They're going to actually implement some sort of zoning regulations for the industry and regulate approval for projects more closely going forward. So how's the industry responding? Similar to Amsterdam, kind of hurry up and wait, but there is some rerouting possibilities as well. We haven't seen a whole lot of projects, new projects launched in the largest data center market in the world in 2022, but there will be a lot in the pipeline. And when these new transmission lines are lit, we will see a flood of new capacity in a couple of years, we think. But in the meantime, there are projects in the exurbs of the Northern Virginia area that could fill in gaps and also serve as new interconnection points, depending on how this all plays out. In Frederick, you have the Quantum Loophole campus being built very quickly right now. They're scrambling to get that up and running. They got contracts in place with data centers that want to build on that campus. They're building a massive new fiber route for basically virtual interconnection with Ashburn. But even there, you still have time to get that thing up and running. So it's going to be at least a year, but probably a lot sooner than the power transmission lines will be developed. There's also Henrico County, which is where Richmond, Virginia is, and it's on a major route from the cable landing stations in Virginia Beach up through Richmond and then onward to Ashburn. There's capacity in place there, so certainly there will be opportunity to fill in some gaps there, perhaps to build out more. The question would be whether or not they might be affected by the same transmission problems as Ashburn. So that's the question there. All right, so that's the long-term thing that's happening within the market, and kind of a common question being wrestled with both on the regulatory side and on the utility provisioning side. But in the middle of all of this, we have another problem throwing a wrench into everything, and that's this energy crisis. And I think what's most extraordinary about the energy crisis is that it's sort of a countervailing issue. So on one hand, while we're trying to figure out how to actually do things more sustainably going forward, now we have a problem. We're just trying to get as much power as we can as quickly and cheaply as possible, spinning up fossil fuels energy plants again, and trying to deal with this short-term crisis. So let's take a look at what's happening there. Energy prices, they started rising in Europe especially before the war in Ukraine. And they were rising sharply in some countries as a result of pent-up demand following the pandemic and a lack of supply. But the war took the whole thing even higher. And in some cases, in some of the European markets, Q4 2021 pricing before the war was 3 to 4 times what it had been for the entire 4 years before that. So it's been very dramatic, and in some cases projected to go still higher. Now, apparently, since I put this together, there's been some talk that things are tempering a bit, and the increases over the course of this year won't be quite as drastic as they had previously thought, but prices are expected to go still higher nonetheless. Now, we're going to talk about this in relation to the colocation sector, but we have to ask ourselves, do energy price increases directly correlate with increases in colocation pricing? And the answer to that is that it's complicated. We track pricing on a biannual basis at TeleGeography, and this last cycle we spent a lot of time on the phone with our contributors, trying to nail down what was happening, trying to make sure that we were getting the most accurate picture, and getting their sense of, how much are prices going up? If they haven't gone up yet, why? What are all the factors involved here? And the feedback had to do with every one of the reasons here that you see as to why things don't always pan out exactly as you would expect based on the macroeconomic indicators. One thing has to do with the lag effect with contracts. So if you have a supplier with a 3-year energy contract and it hasn't come due yet, you won't see the effect of the current situation in the energy markets until that contract is renewed, and then you'll start to see it. So there's something of a lag there. The other thing is that while a lot of data center operators will pass through power rates to the end user, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes there is more of a rolling increase, and we've heard of cases where even starting right now, like as of this month, you're going to see price increases X% up to a threshold. Sometimes the effect will be felt very harshly and very immediately. In other cases, you'll sort of be eased into it. Another thing that we're going to see in the responses that we got from operators, especially about expectations for what's happening over the course of this year, is that the inflationary cost of energy can be kind of tucked away into other parts of the data center contract sometimes. And one of the common ways to do that would be to increase cross-connect prices, which really have no bearing at all on energy, but can be a way to buffer some of that cost increase elsewhere. So you'll see all of these reflected in the data that we've seen. Looking at what's been the trajectory up to now, and I kind of want to just focus on that period up to between 2021 and H2 2022. We have seen prices increasing in Asia, in Europe, in particular. Looking at individual operator responses over this period, we've seen some indicating that their prices have already risen 20% or more over the course of the past year and will go still higher. I guess I'd better explain that US line, shouldn't I? That doesn't exactly. This is a really interesting example of how things don't always plan out according to what you would expect in the macroeconomic situation. And this is just the averages. Full disclosure, I mean, as we all know, there are going to be individual operators who've been increasing all the way through this period. But in the case of the US, we've had a long-term phase of very fierce competition, which has been kind of counter to the inflationary effect of the market to some degree. We've also seen operators with excess inventory to unload, and so that's why we've had a slight decline on our trend line here. That said, looking toward the future, looking through 2023, expectations across the board, everyone is telling us prices are going to increase, and in some cases very drastically. What you're looking at here is a full trend line, a statistical range. Low to high is the blue bar. The median is the light blue circle. So in the case of the European markets here, what you're basically seeing is that every operator who responded said, we expect pricing to inflate at least 10%. Some, Amsterdam, London, Frankfurt, 20 to 40% over the course of this next year. The expectations have been slightly lower in the other markets, but still very high compared to our historical responses to this question. Now, here's the same thing for cross connects. And so this illustrates that even though this is something that sits there in your data center, isn't dependent on the cost of energy at all, everyone's expecting prices to go up for cross connects. So that will certainly buffer some of the cost increases elsewhere. All right, so where does this leave this? Again, really significant disruptions in the short term. There's the biggest interconnection markets in the world. Several of them are looking at entirely new trajectories for the data center industry going forward. But at the same time, we have this major short-term issue with energy prices and how that's going to play out with co-location pricing. But in the long term, we certainly hope that this disruptive period will create the space needed for the industry to figure out a far more sustainable way going forward. And it certainly behooves the industry, and I know this conference is such a wonderful opportunity for us all to get together and talk about how we can stay ahead of what regulators are thinking about doing, regardless of whether those policies that will be coming in place are well-timed, well-crafted. The more we can all do as an industry to stay ahead of that, and the better. And so I very much look forward to discussions about these and other issues with many of you over the course of the conference. And thanks very much for your time.
All right. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It is really nice to all be back together in person at this event. As Alan mentioned, I'm going to be taking a deep dive into global pricing trends, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the TeleGeography website. If you're not, we're here all week, happy to chat. But this is the error message and map you receive when you make it to a part of our website you're not sure you're supposed to be at. And when I was looking at the pricing data this year, I certainly felt like we had ventured into uncharted territory. Historically, the most predictable trends in the bandwidth market have been consistent demand growth and price erosion, and we haven't exactly seen that pan out. Supply chain issues, geopolitical challenges have dramatically limited supply and slowed price erosion. And we've been looking for the first time at the question, are prices actually increasing? So let's take a closer look. First, looking at transport prices, how those trends vary by region, and the ripple effect, how trends in transport trickle down into other services like IP transit, and then navigating to familiar waters. When these issues are resolved, will price erosion and price trends come back to historic levels? So first, looking at transport pricing. Looking at this figure yields pretty familiar results. Global bandwidth prices continue to decline, somewhat. Over the past 3 years, 100G wavelength prices have decreased an average of about 13% compounded annually. And that price erosion has certainly varied by market. Here we've mapped out 100G CAGR price decline over the past 3 years in those blue bars. And as you can see, it ranged from about 24% on Miami, Sao Paulo to just 6% on London, Singapore. And overall, what we've seen is on those routes with a little more ample supply, like Miami, Sao Paulo, price erosion rates have been higher. On routes with those limited supply, such as the Europe to Asia route, Trans-Pacific, price erosion has been much more muted. But overall, the biggest story really is that all of these rates of price erosion are dramatically slower than what we've seen in the longer-term trend. Again, we've got our CAGR price decline over the past 3 years in those blue bars compared with the longer-term historical trend in the turquoise. As you can see across all of these routes, it's a dramatic slowdown from previous years. Between 2017 and 2019, we saw 100G prices decrease about 23% compounded annually. That's compared to the 13% over the past 3 years. There are a variety of factors in this. Market maturity. 100G prices are already extremely competitive on a number of these routes, like the transatlantic, the Trans-Pacific. But really, it is those delayed new network projects and upgrades to existing systems that have limited supply and limited competitive price pressure on a number of these routes. And before I do leave this slide, somewhat surprisingly is that London, New York, where price erosion has kept pace a little bit with historical trends, we have seen a number of new systems going in the Atlantic, some upgrades to existing networks that may have bolstered supply and competition there. But across most routes, a dramatic slowdown in what we've seen in terms of price erosion. And this slide just takes a deeper dive into 2 regions that have been especially impacted by supply constraints, routes within Asia and those across the Pacific. Here we've mapped out our 100G prices in those dark blue columns and our CAGR price decline over the past 3 years in those red dots. And aside from London, New York, our comparison all the way to the left, you can see those CAGR price declines are in single digits across almost all of those routes. They averaged about just 7% price erosion over the past 3 years. And that's really perpetuated some price differences, particularly on the Trans-Pacific route. Looking all the way to the right of this figure, that Hong Kong LA price and LA Singapore, they're still almost twice the price of LA Tokyo, and that's been pretty consistent over the past 3 years. Now, there are a number of planned systems going in on that LA Singapore route in particular, that when that new supply hits the market, we're likely to see some of these differences compress. But for now, they've been pretty maintained. And it's not just in the Trans-Pacific market, but globally as well. Those more moderate rates of price erosion have helped to maintain global price differences. Here we've mapped out our 100G lease prices relative to London, New York. London, New York being that thin pink line there at the bottom. And as you can see, a big range in pricing still. London, Singapore, about 4.5 times the price of London, New York. LA, Tokyo, about 3.2 times the price in 2022. That's not to say there hasn't been some convergence over time. If you take a look at Miami, Sao Paulo, that red line right there, you can see it was almost 7 times the price of London, New York in 2017. And that's down to just 3.5 times the price today. That we don't ever expect to see a universal price due to differences in underlying demand, the costs of those systems, but generally we expect to see some convergence. And if you look from 2020 to 2022, when we started to see these supply chain issues, more moderate rates of price erosion, those differences really have been sustained or even amplified on some of these key global routes. And it's not just across routes, but within markets as well. We still see a wide range in pricing reported, even in the most competitive bandwidth markets. Here we've mapped out the range in reported pricing in the dark blue versus our weighted median price in the turquoise. And across all of these routes, the high price averaged about 4.7 times the low in 2022. A number of factors do go into that range, such as lease terms. Longer term leases often incur lower pricing than a single year lease. Customers buying in bulk may receive lower pricing than those leasing a single wavelength. The type of customer, is this capacity being used for internal use versus someone who's going to resell in the wholesale market? And especially in the market today, while we haven't seen any providers increase pricing, we have heard of a number of deals occurring on this higher end of this range than normal. With more limited supply, there's less competitive pressure to lower their pricing. But overall, that weighted median price still falls much closer to the low than the high. So the bulk of our transactions are occurring still on the lower end of this range today. And despite slowing price erosion, if you are able to upgrade to a higher capacity circuit, it has become much more affordable over this term. Here we've mapped out the 10 to 100G price multiples in 2017 in that dark blue versus 2022 in the turquoise. And as you can see, it has compressed across all of these routes globally. In 2017, it was about 6 times the price for 10 times the capacity, and that's down to about 4.5 times today for 10 times the capacity. A number of factors going into that compression, including 100G price erosion, outpacing that of the more mature 10G service, as well as increasing levels of demand for higher capacity circuits in all of these markets. And today, 100G does comprise a majority of the sales mix in a lot of these routes. So we've looked at how price erosion is slowing, but let's take a closer look at why is this happening. Again, delays in capacity upgrades and new cable activation are really driving a lot of this. Upgrades, which historically took 6 to 12 weeks, are taking over 35 weeks on some routes. And fewer cables with inventory at one time means less competitive price pressure. Also, increasing equipment prices. Carriers are seeking to recoup equipment prices with less aggressive pricing. And that pace of demand, while still high, has slowed on many routes. And that decelerating demand growth has resulted in a slowing reduction in the unit cost of capacity. And just to keep with that last point, it is important to look at demand growth and price erosion together to assess their total impact on the market. So here we've mapped out our annual rate of demand growth across the top here versus our annual rate of lease price erosion along this side. Above this line implies that demand growth is outpacing price erosion. Some implied revenues are increasing. Below this line indicates more aggressive price erosion in the market, potential for revenues to decrease. So where did all of our core routes come out this year with these new pricing trends? Well, almost all of them fell above this line, indicating that demand growth seems to be outpacing price erosion on major routes. So there is some implied revenue growth in a lot of these markets, which is good news for many people here at this conference this week. So how are these trends impacting other services? Well, IP transit pricing is largely a reflection of a proximity to your interconnection point and the cost of transport to get there. So as transport price erosion has slowed, IP transit price erosion has as well. Here again, we've mapped out our CAGR price decline for 10 gig IP transit ports over the past 3 years in those dark blue bars versus our longer term trend in the turquoise. As you can see, in most major markets worldwide, it is a slower pace of price erosion. Over the past 3 years, 10 gig ports decreased an average of just 16% versus 23% from 2017 to 2019. And that, as it has in the transport market, has perpetuated some global price differences. Here we've mapped out our 10 gig IP transit port prices and CAGR price decline in key cities within Asia. As you can see, there certainly remains a wide range in pricing, ranging from Taiwan being just 1.5 times Singapore at the end of 2022 versus Jakarta, which is a little over 8 times the price of Singapore at the end of the year. Now, in a lot of these markets, there are factors aside from transport that are weighing in on this, such as different levels of competition, demand, and also government regulations play in. But that transport to Singapore or the US to access content, exchange traffic, is really a driving force in these prices. Now, there are a number of planned network projects that will touch a majority of these markets in the transport side of things. So once those do come online, if we do see a reduction in transport pricing, you may see some of these differences shrink going forward. And that's kept price ranges wide, just as it has in the transport market. Here again, we've highlighted our range in IP transit pricing and that weighted median price in key global cities. Similar factors to what we saw before, lease terms and volumes factor into this range in pricing. Specifically for transit, though, also a carrier's regional strength. We've seen a lot of providers establishing IP POPs outside of their home regions. They may be priced a little bit higher than those smaller, more competitive regional providers. In addition, a premium service. If you are able to offer a service with superior performance, lower latency, jitter, that has become a distinguishing feature for a lot of IP transit providers. They are able to incur a little bit more of a premium price. And while 10 gig ports are still the major unit of transaction across most markets, we have seen a shift in a lot of core markets towards 100 gig ports, particularly within the US, Europe, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And today, 100 gig ports are about 6.9 times the price of a 10 gig, so a higher multiple than what we're seeing in the transport market. But a lot of IP providers suggest that the decision for customers to upgrade really isn't purely financial. There's also the issue of complexity. Managing one cross connect for a single 100 gig port is easier than managing multiple 10 gigs and those cross connects, as well as future-proofing the network. As we saw during COVID, customers are wanting to upgrade their networks now to prevent any unexpected spikes in traffic, ensure their network is going to perform well going forward. So can we return to where we were? Can we get back to familiar waters? Well, I think we can. Delays in network supply are not expected to last forever. And while they may last into 2023, keeping price points fairly stable in the short term, no one expects this to last forever. In fact, there is a surge in cable investment globally. Here we've mapped out the construction cost of new submarine cables from 2019 to 2021 in that dark blue versus 2022 to 2024 in the turquoise. As you can see, there is investment going in across all routes globally, particularly Asia and the Trans-Pacific, about $4.3 billion in investment combined across those two routes. So how will this new supply impact pricing trends? Well, given the current delays and more stable price points, new supply does have the potential to return price erosion rates to historic levels. But new supply will not impact every route in the same way. There are a variety of factors that shape how new supply does impact pricing trends on a given route, including a diverse route. Networks that traverse a unique path can fetch a price premium, especially if there are few alternatives and suppliers in that market. The premium isn't as much as it has been in the past, maybe 10 to 15%, but it is there. That said, if you are injecting a lot of new competition and supply into some of those markets that were previously underserved, you can expect to see some shockwaves to pricing in the market. We certainly did see that on the Australia to Singapore route over the past few years with the launch of ASC and Indigo, a lot of new providers, new supply on that route. So there's the potential for that going forward. Also, direct routes. Direct systems offer cost and latency improvements over existing systems, particularly those with intermediary landings. Lower unit costs are often passed along to customers in the forms of lower wavelength prices. And we certainly saw this happen when the first direct United States to Brazil cables launched a few years ago. And Miami Sao Paulo continues to report some of the highest rates of price erosion. Type of competitor. Who is launching this new supply? Is it existing players on a given route who may be more inclined to make more moderate price reductions versus a new market entrant, which would trigger not only pre-sales from existing players who may want to lock in customer business, but charge lower pricing to win customers themselves? Or is this a company using this new supply for internal use versus selling it in the wholesale market? Now, we've certainly seen a lot of changes on the Los Angeles-Sydney route over the past few years, particularly with the launch of Hawaii, we saw a surge in price erosion. Now, there was probably a combination of pre-sales, a new market player, and as you can see in comparison to the RFS of Southern Cross Next, those are existing players in the market. We have seen price erosion there, but it's been a little bit more moderate so far. It's still early to see the final impact of Next, but so far, not as big of a drop there. And technological improvements. New cables may cost more in the future on a per kilometer basis, but they'll offer a lot more bandwidth, and those lower unit cost declines should enable price erosion going forward. In addition, SDM or high fiber count cables continue to dramatically lower that unit cost floor and could potentially make fiber pair ownership on some of these routes much more affordable. So in conclusion and looking ahead, we have seen an unprecedented slowing of price erosion, but price declines have not stopped. And the expectation is that when some of these issues are resolved, price erosion will return to historically observed levels. That will trickle down into those other markets, particularly IP transit, perhaps lowering the premium for some of those secondary markets. And while there will be an impact from new supply, how each route will respond will be different based on a variety of factors that we've discussed here today. So thank you.
All right, going to wind things down now. So today, I'm going to be looking at the decline of a US-centric global network. Get these slides up here. So the decline of the US is a pretty reliable headline. Some headlines here I've grabbed from the last couple decades. You can see are the end of US dominance. The US empire is crumbling before our eyes, right? It's the end of things. This also extends to the realm of global networking as well. So some headlines from that point of view recently, there's a rally for less US-centric internet from 2005, the end of American internet dominance as well here. So let's look at this topic in a bit more detail, but first, let's have a few disclaimers. Many aspects of global networking have historically been US-centric. I'm only going to touch on one part, and that is long-haul network infrastructure right here. Also, I hope to offer a very unbiased point of view, but let's be honest. I'm an American. So if you see any eagles flying around the audience during the talk today, don't be alarmed. Okay, so to get started, let's look back at time. Was the US ever truly the center of the global network? So here's a map of the early internet from 1973. And this map shows what's kind of interesting. It's the first international link. The first link was a satellite link to Norway, and then a link down to London. But that's very long ago. That's 50 years ago. Let's go a little bit more current. Let's go 20 years ago. So we've been doing this for a long time at TeleGeography. And here's one of our old ancient maps. It was even in black and white. It was that old. This shows interregional internet routes. And so you can see here in 2003, 98% of all interregional internet capacity was linked to the United States. That's amazing, right? That's a ton of capacity. But let's look also just at not just interregional, but overall, all the capacity that was connected. And 20 years ago, 42%, just under half, was all linked to the United States. That's even with, at that point in time, already some strong developments with intra-regional connectivity within Asia and Europe. The maps you can see here do show those major intra-regional links in Asia and Europe, as well as those big thick lines heading to the US. And submarine cables help to enforce this centrality. This map is showing the lit capacity of major interregional cables in 2004, in March of that year. And it's pretty amazing. You know, in the Atlantic, there was 4.6 terabits potential of lit capacity, half that amount across the Pacific, even less US to Latin America. Then, for the one right here that is not a US connected route, Europe to Asia, 0.03 terabits, right? So very US-centric topology, both for IP networks and for submarine cable capacity. Also back in time, the US was among the cheapest places to connect to the internet. This figure here is showing the median monthly IP transit price per meg for an STM1 in 2006. And one quick note here for the millennials and Gen Z in the audience. An STM1 is 155 megabits per second, okay? So you can see here on the far left, Washington, D.C., very low, about $25 per meg per month. Much higher in other cities here, Singapore and Sao Paulo especially here on the right of the chart. Very expensive back then. Also, more recently, content provider networks, they began very US-centric. The maps here are showing Google's network in 2017, Meta from 2019. Both had fairly US-centric topologies to them. So let's look now at what's been happening. So in the last 20 years or so, are we seeing the decline that was promised to us? Is the US becoming less centric to the global network? Well, there's definitely weakening US centricity when looking at the amount of total international capacity around the world. Globally, it's declined from about 42% in 2003. Now it's about 27%. So just over a quarter is still connected to the United States. So it has been going down slowly. But let's look at the other angle here, which is the interregional portion. So that, as you recall from the earlier slides, was about 98%. Has that been changing? Well, yeah, that's changed a little bit. It's down to about 82%. So we're also seeing weakening there. The US not nearly as dominant as it once was for interregional. But these two lines here don't really tell the full story. We need to look at how it's happening within regions. Do certain regions have a more or less need to connect to the United States over other parts of the world? So let's look first at Europe and Asia to get started with. So these two regions, you can see they have had a fairly slow, steady decline in terms of the share of their bandwidth that connects to the United States. In the case of Asia, you can see there it's just below 40% now, and Europe is about at 20%. These regions both have very strong growth intra-regionally. So the bandwidth among Asian countries, within European countries, has been growing very rapidly. But also the Europe to Asia route has been growing rapidly in recent years. That does help to reduce some of the connectivity happening to the United States. The next two regions let's look at are Africa and the Middle East. And here you see a really very clear trend. The US is not really that important for Africa or the Middle East right now in terms of having direct links. This happened years ago, though. You can see in 2010 or so, it went to almost zero. There's very little need for these two regions to connect to the US. Now, why is that? It's just more affordable and cheaper and lower latency to connect to Europe than to go to the United States. So that's why you see most of the bandwidth from Africa and the Middle East interregionally is going to Europe, not to the US anymore. The last two regions are also kind of interesting. Let's look at Oceania and Latin America. So Latin America, almost all of the interregional bandwidth for Latin America is linked to the United States. The other share is within the countries in the region, it's intra-regional. For Oceania, that's when we've seen some big changes over the last 10 years. Part of that is due to increasing intra-oceanic bandwidth between Australia and New Zealand, but also the number of new cables linking Oceania to Asia. So that's risen as a share of the overall capacity for Oceania. Let's look also at a different way now, besides regions. Let's look at the type of company. And this chart here is showing a comparison between content, cloud, CDN operators as one category here in the turquoise color versus red, which is everybody else, the carriers, research networks, enterprises, right? So you can see here that there is a bit more US centricity for the content, cloud, CDN companies than there is for other operators. That kind of makes sense. You know, if you're a carrier, you can connect, you know, to a CDN, a cloud operator in your own region. You don't need to go to the US directly to have connectivity in many cases. So we've established there is some declining US network centricity happening. So let's look now at some reasons why this could be happening. So one factor is there's a pervasive ability to connect to an internet exchange really all over the world. This is our map, which is internetexchangemap.com. You can see here a vast, vast number of IXs all over the world. So even if your country doesn't have an IX in it, you can probably connect to a nearby country that does have one. You don't need to go to the US to connect to get access to the internet. Besides that, there's often the view that you have to go to the US for content, right? Well, do you really have to go to the US for content? CDNs and caches long ago got rid of the need to have to go to the US to source content. So you know, many non-US carriers, they can connect directly to caches or CDNs in their own country, which does help to reduce some of their need to go to the US. Now, you do have to fill the caches, right? So there's a need to have some bandwidth from the US to these caches for US sourced content. But there are efficiencies with using a caching or CDN approach to limit the need for everybody to have their own link to the United States. So cloud decentralization. The map here is showing cloud regions by provider, and we're going to fast forward these maps over time to see the expansion of cloud regions and companies. We're seeing AWS, Alibaba, Azure, Tencent, Google. We have Oracle coming up here, I think, as well. Yeah, there we go. And the map will stop animating when we get to 2022. Plus, we've added in planned sites as well, so we can kind of see what's going to be happening in the future. There's a clear trend towards decentralization of where cloud regions are located. So you don't have to connect to the US to access the cloud anymore, or even to Europe or Asia. You can get it often in your local market, which does help to make the US, to some degree, less central. Next point here is we're seeing massive investment in cables, as Brianna mentioned in her slides. But we look at what's happening in terms of how they break out by investment to US connected cables versus non-US connected cables. The chart here, the dark blue, is cables that do go to the United States, and the turquoise is those that do not. And so the first date range there is 96 to 2000. It was majority going to the US, right? You look at what's happening in recent years, the majority of investment is on cables that do not link to the US. So the most recent time period here, 2021, 2025, 70% of the investment is on non-US linked cables. So helping to build out the rest of the world and expand connectivity there. The price advantage has also narrowed the US once had over other countries. We're not dealing with STM1s anymore. We're up to 10 gigs in this chart here, at least, to make a comparison between 2012 and 2022. And you can see here, what I've done is I've mapped the multiple of the price for these cities over the Washington DC price between this 10-year period. And so on the far left of the chart here, the Sao Paulo price was nearly 13 times higher than the Washington DC price. It's down to 3 now. Similar trend in many other markets around the world. And on the far right there, you can see the price in Frankfurt. It's actually cheaper slightly than the price in Washington. So there's been a big change there over the last 20 years in how the prices have become more similar. Another pretty obvious point here is that geography matters, obviously. So the US is not and never was really the best location for every country to connect around the world. So it's much better to connect locally or regionally to optimize for latency. You can see here I've taken some sample cable latencies for 2 countries, South Africa here to Portugal. It's 2/3 the latency if you go directly from South Africa to the US. For India, it's even more extreme. I mean, it's obvious. It's just closer for India to connect to Singapore or France than to going all the way around the world to the United States. So let's look now at some factors that maybe aren't behind this. I covered those that I think could be behind it, but there's some that I think are kind of maybe false ones. The first one is, what about post-Snowden worries? So maybe it's an old story, but 10 years ago, whenever the Snowden documents were released, and we were found to be engaging in lots of espionage around the world with the U.S. and its allies, there was worries that there could be a need to deconnect from the U.S. to route traffic in different ways. Brazil was very notable in their efforts publicly, stating they wanted to break free from the U.S.-centric internet, to go offline from it. So let's see how that's going for Brazil. So Brazil in 2013, their share of international bandwidth that linked to the United States was 82%. So they wanted to go offline from the US-centric internet. That's going pretty well. They're down to 82% right now. So even though there may have been some small share of their demand that maybe is going via the L-link cable directly to Europe, let's say, the vast majority of Brazilian capacity is still connected to the United States, right? So there hasn't been a change from that point of view, at least. Their angle here, which is always a hot topic, is what about blocked cables? Has the denial of cables between China and the U.S., is that part of why we're seeing less U.S. centricity? And the map here is showing the planned cables in the Pacific Ocean right now. I see quite a lot of them, actually. I don't see there being no cables. I don't see the U.S. being totally ignored and bypassed. There's still many cables happening here. What we are seeing, though, is a change in where cables go. They're still going to the major traditional landing in Japan, new landing sites, the Philippines, Singapore. I didn't label here in Indonesia also. So we are seeing some changes in how cables are being built as a result of some of the cables being blocked between China and the U.S. But I don't think we're seeing that as being a factor, at least right now, in decreasing U.S. centricity. In fact, it seems that we're going to see more intra-Asian cables built to continue to allow the traffic to be funneled across the Pacific into these markets here, into Japan, Philippines, and Singapore. So what's the future for a US-centric global network? Or is there a future at all? Let's see. Data centers, clearly a main driver for connectivity globally. Many of them are in the United States, as the map here shows. So even though they are spread globally, there is a need to connect data centers to each other. So clearly by the nature here, we're going to have more bandwidth and cables to link the US data centers to the other data centers around the world. Also, many carriers do still need US connections. This chart here that I created is showing the share of operators with at least one link to the United States. So in 2003, over half of all operators that we tracked in our research had at least one link to the US. That was 284 operators, so a pretty good number there. So you can see that line's going down. So the number of the share operators who had that has gone down to 29%. But at the same time, the number of carriers, that's increased actually. There's 328 operators that we think right now have at least one link to the United States. Also, this was an interesting chart, I thought, because if you look at the last 6-7 years here, it's stabilized really. You're still seeing about this 30% or so of all the operators have at least one link to the United States. So the U.S. is not going away as a place where some companies or carriers need to have at least one link to. Another issue here is whether or not the U.S. is keeping its edge in submarine cable capacity. I began by showing the lit capacity of cables and how the cables in the Atlantic and Pacific were dominant compared to other parts of the world. I also showed a chart showing this massive investment in non-U.S. landed cables. So are we going to see the U.S. becoming less important because of this surging investment in cables that don't link to the U.S.? Well, right here I'm showing the existing potential capacity for the Atlantic, Pacific, and Europe to Asia. So U.S. connected ones there, Atlantic, Pacific, are still fairly dominant, right? But let's add in on top of this all of the planned cables and what their capacities would do to these values. And to me, what's interesting here was that the Pacific, with all the planned cables there, it would almost meet the Atlantic. Europe to Asia would more than double, so it's definitely true. A lot of capacity is being added to Europe Asia. That's definitely happening. But Europe to Asia is not going to come close to being able to replace Trans-Pacific in terms of the maximum capacity of cables. So what that means is going forward is as that capacity is used up, you're still going to see, I think, a heavy focus in Pacific being a key route for Asia to connect to the rest of the world. So I think looking forward now, it's pretty clear the U.S. is going to remain a leading interregional hub especially. I showed the chart at the beginning that showed the U.S. had 98% of the world's interregional bandwidth going down to 82% in 2022. I added the other regions here so you can see them as well. So you can see Europe kind of up and down there, but just over 60%. Asia has been kind of rising a little bit. The other regions down there, the bottom lines, don't have much of a role in providing the overall interregional capacity to the rest of the world. If we look at our forecast that we developed internally here and see what that means, we see the U.S. declining still slowly to about 80% by 2030. Europe holding more or less steady, but kind of declining as well. The big change here is Asia. We definitely see Asia surging, having a larger role in accounting for a greater share of global interregional bandwidth, so nearing 40% by 2030 there. So finally, while this talk has focused on why the U.S. is declining as a major node of the global network, it's not collapsing. It's not going to go away anytime soon. It still remains a major part of connectivity. But also, just because it's going down, it's not a bad thing, right? We shouldn't be afraid that the U.S. is going to have less interregional bandwidth than it used to have in the past. The world needs to have diverse, robust, resilient connectivity across all regions. So we hope that continues. More cables, more bandwidth for everybody. And that concludes my talk and the workshop. Thank you. Would you like these slides? Do you want these slides? If so, you can scan the QR code here now, and we will get them over to you whenever they are made available. We have time for questions if you want to have questions, or we can just go to the bar now.
Thank you. Your presentations, all of you, are always very interesting and relevant and helpful. One area that when I was just looking at the final slide with all the colors, all the networks, I saw one going, I think, from Eastern Russia through, I'm not sure, yeah, all right. Is that from China or Eastern Russia through Siberia, through the Northeast Passage, so-called? And then one that I'm familiar with in Alaska that may eventually or not go through the Arctic to Europe. But do you see, in terms of latency or other choices, more development of those pathways across the Arctic to link the Asia-Pacific and European regions?
Yeah, sure. Our cables have been discussed for a long time, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this conference, we've had these meetings with people talking about cables in the Arctic for probably the last 20 years. So I think there's definitely interest in that, right? The challenge has often been on the commercial side. The latency would be superior for some routes, for sure. And I think now it's an interesting time with the changing, the geopolitical environment changing, and would there be a need to have cables on that route or not on that route? So, yeah, I don't think there's any answer of will we see some or not, but I think that things that have been discussed like this for so many years, eventually they could get built. But the one you're pointing out, I think, is a Russian cable called Polar Express. That goes around Russia there on the western part of the map.
Is it connected to Western Europe?
does not. It's a Russian domestic cable. The first segment of it is already in service. The portion there you're seeing mostly is not in service. Two questions over here.
Thank you. Question is in terms of pricing. What is the prediction in terms of the current satellite constellations and what that will have effect on the pricing as they come online, especially the second version of Starlink, where they link direct between satellites?
So satellite pricing in that terms would be more of a competitor for broadband pricing, right? So it wouldn't be competing with 100 gig wavelengths across these major routes that we were showing in our research. So the purpose of things like Starlink and Kuiper is really to help to reach these underserved regions where you cannot get affordable fiber or 4G, 5G mobile service currently. So from that point of view, the pricing of Starlink, it could be a very competitive offering depending on where you are in the world. But in terms of trying to how it relates to the capacity prices in the Atlantic, the Pacific, there's really no bearing at all because the volumes being sent on submarine cables are massive, are several times greater than what would exist on a Starlink satellite.
You mentioned 35 weeks for an upgrade. It wasn't clear to me if we're still seeing equipment availability or challenges of just personnel to upgrade, or is it a combination of both? And are things getting better in terms of equipment availability?
It's a great question, John. I think we hope to get a better handle on that during this conference and ask people how things are going right now. I would have a better answer for you on Wednesday, probably. If there's somebody here who has a comment on that, I'm happy to hear from somebody if they can speak to the issue of upgrades and, okay. Yeah, that's telling perhaps.
Hello, hi, I'm from Africa, so I'll ask a question related to that. It's kind of in the middle of the mix, east to west, so on, in terms of interconnection. I also noted that you had South Africa there with the latency to the US. But if you look at the number of cables around the West, it's significantly more than that, saying going all the way to South Africa. And then you have a lot of activity going on in Nigeria with cloud-related stuff. A lot of activity going on in Kenya and East Africa, really cloud-related stuff, and dense connectivity all the way right through to Marseille, into Europe, and so on. But when you then projected stuff going, Africa was still empty. Was that the way you see it, or just it wasn't the subject of the discussion today? In terms of the cloud blobs, and because actually you've got two parts where the latency is half, probably not quite half, but a lot less, from West Africa, for instance. And there's a lot happening in North Africa with its proximity to Europe.
So I mean, in Africa, I mean, the key nodes, in Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, we're seeing a lot more intra-regional connectivity coming into those places as well, and less of a need, honestly, to go to Europe for some operators. You're seeing heavy investment by the cloud operators into the region, which does help to keep things local and to have better latency going to those regions. North Africa, though, I think is going to still remain heavily focused on Europe just due to the proximity of it. Yeah.
In the earlier slides, Steve Alden from Global Marine, you were talking about in Europe the decline of data centers, or not building anymore because of the power situation. Do you think that the developing wind farm infrastructure in the North Sea in particular could turn that around? And equally, you could say off the east coast of the States, there's a lot of plans, isn't there? Could they become sort of energy hubs that would allow data centers to be, restarted, the construction of?
I'll just go up there.
Yeah, I mean, any opportunity we have to further develop sustainable energy sources will ultimately be a massive help in all of this. But that said, you know, when you think about the short-term issues we have, especially with price volatility, I think it's going to be a little while before we see the full effects of that transition. Yeah.
Thank you.
The man in the yellow pants has a question.
Okay, so if you had to invest, let's say that your 100% of your 401k had to be invested in digital infrastructure, what percentage would you invest in data centers, cable transport capacity, or terrestrial telecommunications? This is not an investment advice, by the way, just interesting. Oh, Bitcoin, forget about that.
Is there an answer to this question, actually? I don't know. I mean, because listen, they all work together, obviously. You can't have one without the other. But in terms of which one is the more valuable segment, the higher returns, data centers, I would guess. But the exact share of that mix, I don't know how I would play that out. John, do you have a comment on the data center?
70%. Nice.
How much money do you have in data centers, John? John, how much of your portfolio do you have in data centers?
70%.
70%.
That's the answer. It's the right answer.
Personally, I'd put it in cables, because I love cables, Nigel. I'm a true believer.
At the detriment of your family's financial health, you love cables. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Tough question.
Alan and team, thank you very much. Very thought-provoking presentation as usual. Julian Rawle from Julian Rawle Consulting. Alan, I just want to ask you about the way that you've defined centricity is in terms of the number of cables and the amount of bandwidth. What about where content is actually being developed? Is that not also a driver?
Well, that was addressed in terms of looking at the slide I showed with there's no need to go to the U.S. to get content, right? I don't have data on where is content made. What percentage is made in the U.S. or made in Europe or China? I don't know where it's made. But caches don't really care where it's made. Neither do CDNs, right? They can just host it from wherever. Getting them filled with the content is less. It's less reliant upon where it's made, right? Once you have it made, it's just copied everywhere. Yeah, I don't really know how to answer the question of where's content made per se, but it's an interesting point of view, though. Okay, I think we're at time now. If there's any more questions, we'll wrap things up. If you have any more questions, got one more last question here.
Hi there, Dean Bubley. A question. In various parts of the world, particularly Europe, there's a lot of discussion about the relative costs of the access network versus the essentially implied costs for content or hyperscale providers. I was wondering whether there's a sort of balancing item here, which is the cost of subsea and data center infrastructure, and whether you're seeing any discussions about the sort of balance of national capex versus international capex and how that impacts the regulatory debates on what's sometimes called fair contribution or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, this topic's been around for a long time about people pulling their fair share. But often when I hear these debates, I don't think there's enough discussion of the amount of money that the content providers have invested, not just in cables, but in data centers and fiber around the world. So I don't think it's always fair for the carriers to claim they need to get money back from the content providers. I mean, without Google, without Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, I'm not sure who would be needing to have a 5G plan for some of these carriers, right? So they kind of need each other. But it's a question for, I guess, the governments to grapple with. I don't want to get involved in that. All right, thank you, everybody, for attending. So we'll see you next year, hopefully. There won't be another surge or anything, so.